The silence began on a Tuesday. It wasn't an immediate, deafening silence, but the kind that creeps in at the edges of your life, subtle and insidious. My son, David, was a creature of habit. Every Sunday evening, like clockwork, his name would flash on my phone's screen, and for 30 minutes we would talk about his week, his work, and most importantly, his son, my 8-year-old grandson, Matthew. He'd tell me about Matthew's latest obsession with dinosaurs, his surprisingly good goal at soccer practice, or the complicated plot of a cartoon he was obsessed with. David was a single father, had been for 5 years, and those calls were the anchor of my week, the proof that despite the distance, a 2-hour drive that felt like a continent, we were still connected. When the Sunday call didn't come, I felt a flicker of unease, but I dismissed it. He was a busy man, an architect. Maybe a project deadline was looming. I sent a text. "Everything okay? Missed your voice." The message showed as delivered, but not read. The flicker became a small, steady flame of worry. By Wednesday, the flame was afire. I called 3 times. Each ringtone cut off and went to voicemail after a few rings, a sure sign the phone was off or dead. My messages grew more frantic. "David, please just let me know you're all right." "This isn't like you." I tried his office. His assistant, a kindly woman named Brenda, said he hadn't been in all week, hadn't called in sick. That was the moment the floor seemed to drop away. David lived for his work. He would never, ever just not show up. I called Jessica, his ex-wife. The conversation was brief and icy. "I haven't heard from him, Alina," she said, her voice a practiced blend of boredom and annoyance. "He probably just took Matthew on a last-minute trip. You know how impulsive he can be." But I didn't know that. David was the least impulsive person I knew. He planned his grocery lists. The idea of him jetting off without a word was ludicrous. Jessica's dismissal felt wrong. A deliberate misreading of the man she'd been married to for a decade. The second Sunday passed without a call. 2 weeks, 14 agonizing days of silence. My life narrowed to the screen of my phone, my ears straining for a ringtone that never came. I didn't sleep. I barely ate. The worry was a physical presence, a cold stone in my gut. My friends told me to call the police, but a small, stubborn part of me held out hope. Maybe he'd lost his phone. Maybe there was a simple explanation, but the dread was a tide, rising steadily, threatening to drown me. On the 15th day, a Monday shrouded in a bleak, drizzling rain, I could take it no longer. I didn't call the police from my quiet living room. I would go to them, but first, I had to see his house. I had to know. The 2-hour drive was a blur of windshield wipers and terrible radio music, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. Every worst-case scenario played out in my mind like a horror movie trailer. David's house, a modest but charming craftsman bungalow he'd been so proud to buy, sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. It looked dead. The lawn, usually impeccably manicured by David's own hands, was shaggy and overgrown. Newspapers, swollen with rainwater, were piled on the porch like a funeral mound. The curtains in the front window were drawn tight. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was wrong. All of it was wrong. I fumbled with my keychain, my fingers numb with cold and fear, and found the spare key David had given me for emergencies. This was an emergency. The lock turned with a heavy thunk. The door swung inward, and the smell hit me first. A stale, musty odor, the smell of a space closed up for too long, underpinned by the faint, sour tang of spoiled milk. "David," my voice was a reedy whisper, swallowed by the oppressive silence. "Matthew, it's Grandma." The living room was tidy, but frozen in time. A half-drunk mug of coffee sat on the coffee table, a skin of greenish mold floating on its surface. Matthew's favorite blue blanket was crumpled on the sofa. David's laptop was closed on his desk. Everything was in its place, yet the absence was a screaming void. I moved through the downstairs, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors. The kitchen, dishes in the sink, a loaf of bread on the counter, now sprouting a coat of blue fur. A child's drawing, a lopsided dinosaur, was held to the refrigerator by a magnet. It was titled "Me and Dad" in Matthew's careful printing. Terror, cold and sharp, began to crystallize in my veins. I took the stairs 2 at a time, my breath catching in my throat. David's bedroom was empty, the bed neatly made. It was Matthew's room that stopped me cold. The door was ajar. The room was a mess, toys strewn across the floor, the bedclothes a tangled heap. But it was the silence that was most terrifying. A little boy's room should never be that silent. "Matthew," I called, my voice trembling. "Sweetheart, are you here? It's Grandma Aliner." Nothing. I checked the closet, my hands shaking as I pushed aside tiny shirts and pants. Empty. I was about to turn away, a sob building in my chest when I saw it, a slight movement from under the bed, a faint shuffling sound. I dropped to my knees, the hardwood digging into my bones, and lifted the drooping edge of the bed skirt. And there he was. My grandson was curled into a tight ball, pressed against the far wall. He was clutching a grubby-looking stuffed stegosaurus, his knuckles white. He was filthy, his face streaked with dried tears and grime. His eyes, wide and unblinking, stared at me, but they didn't see me. They were pools of pure animal terror. "Matthew," I breathed, my own tears falling freely now. "Oh, my sweet boy, it's okay. Grandma's here." I reached a hand toward him slowly, as one would approach a frightened deer. He flinched violently, pressing himself further into the wall, a low, keening sound escaping his lips. It wasn't a cry. It was the sound of a soul being shredded. It took me 20 minutes of soft, coaxing words to gently extract him from his hiding place. He didn't speak. He didn't make a sound beyond that terrible whimper. He was light as a feather in my arms, trembling uncontrollably. I carried him downstairs, my mind reeling. How long had he been here? Alone? Where was David? I called 911 from David's landline, my voice cracking as I explained to the dispatcher that my son was missing, and I had found my traumatized grandson alone in the house. While we waited for the police, I tried to give Matthew some water and a banana. He drank the water greedily, but he wouldn't eat. He just curled into my side on the sofa, his small body rigid, his eyes fixed on the door as if expecting a monster to walk through it. The arrival of the police, 2 officers, a man and a woman, their faces professionally neutral, sent Matthew into a fresh wave of silent panic. He buried his face in my side, his whole body shaking. The female officer, Officer Flores, had kind eyes. She knelt in front of us. "Hi, Matthew," she said softly. "My name is Maria. You're safe now. Can you tell me what happened?" Matthew didn't respond. He didn't even look at her. "He hasn't spoken a word since I found him," I said, my voice thick with tears. "My son, David, he's missing. Something terrible has happened." The officers began their work. They searched the house. There were no signs of a struggle, no forced entry. David's wallet was on his dresser, his car was in the garage, his phone was gone. It was as if he had simply vanished into thin air. The nightmare had begun, and it was about to get much, much darker. The next 48 hours were a chaotic blur of police questions, hospital visits, and a crushing, debilitating fear. Matthew was admitted to the children's ward for dehydration and observation. A child psychologist, a gentle man named Dr. Evans, tried to work with him, but Matthew remained locked in his silent world. He would only communicate by pointing or with slight nods, and only with me. I never left his side. The police investigation turned up few immediate leads. They interviewed Jessica. She was cool, composed. She expressed appropriate shock and concern, but it felt rehearsed. She said she hadn't seen or heard from David in over a month, which was their usual arrangement. She claimed she'd been out of town visiting a friend the past weekend and had assumed Matthew was with his father. Her alibi, while vague, checked out initially. It was Detective Miller, a seasoned man with a weary face and eyes that missed nothing, who started pulling at the threads. He came to see me at the hospital on the 3rd day. "Mrs. Peterson, we've been looking into David's finances," he said, his voice low and calm. "There are some concerning things." "What kind of things?" I asked, clutching Matthew's small, sleeping hand. "Substantial credit card debt, several large, recent cash withdrawals, and we found records of transactions from an online sports betting site. It appears David had a significant gambling problem." I stared at him, dumbfounded. "No, that's not possible. David, he was so careful with money. He hated risk. That's why he became an architect, for heaven's sake." "It's often the ones you least expect, Mrs. Peterson," Miller said gently. "The debt is real, and we've learned he owed money to some unsavory individuals. A man named Vincent Morty. He has a reputation." The world tilted. Gambling debts. Loan sharks. This was a language from a crime novel, not my son's life. The David I knew was gone, replaced by a stranger with a secret, destructive habit. A day later, another piece of the puzzle slammed into place, this one even more chilling. I was going through David's important documents, a task I'd volunteered for, needing to feel useful, looking for his insurance information, bank statements, anything. In a locked firebox I found the key for in his desk drawer. Nestled among his birth certificate and the deed to the house was a life insurance policy. It was a standard policy, taken out when Matthew was born. The beneficiary was originally Jessica, but there was a change of beneficiary form, dated just 6 months ago. David had changed it. The primary beneficiary was now Matthew Peterson, with me, Alina Peterson, listed as the trustee until he came of age. The death benefit was $1 million. My blood ran cold. I thought of Jessica's cold eyes, her quick dismissal of David's disappearance. I thought of the gambling debts. $1 million. It was a motive, a powerful, twisted motive. I took the policy straight to Detective Miller. His expression hardened as he read it. "This is significant," he said. "We'll need to have a more in-depth conversation with Ms. Jessup." Jessica had gone back to her maiden name after the divorce. "She wouldn't, she could," I stammered, but the words felt hollow. The woman I'd never fully trusted, the woman whose departure had initially broken David's heart, but who he'd later admitted was a relief to be free from, was now at the center of this terrifying mystery. The investigation pivoted. Jessica was brought in for questioning. She was furious, indignant. She claimed she had no idea David had changed the policy. She accused the police of harassing a grieving mother. But under Miller's steady, relentless questioning, her composure began to crack. She couldn't adequately account for all her time during the weekend David disappeared. Her friend's story had inconsistencies. Then the forensics team, doing a second, more thorough sweep of David's house, found something. In the garage, under a stack of moving blankets, was a small, clear plastic bag containing a few grains of a dark, rich soil. It was a type of soil not native to David's garden. And on the concrete floor, barely visible to the naked eye, was a faint, rusty brown smear. It tested positive for blood. David's blood. The theory forming was horrifying. David, deep in debt to dangerous people, had been killed. But by whom? Morty's thugs? Or had Jessica, discovering she'd been cut out of a $1 million policy, decided to take matters into her own hands? Or worse, had the two motives somehow become entangled? The break in the case came from an unexpected source, Matthew. He had been in my care for 2 weeks, living in my small, quiet house. He was still largely silent, but the rigid terror had begun to soften. He would draw for hours, page after page of dark scribbles, of stick figures with angry faces. Dr. Evans said this was progress. He was externalizing his trauma. One afternoon, we were sitting at the kitchen table with a fresh box of crayons. A thunderstorm was brewing outside, the sky darkening to a deep purple. The first rumble of thunder echoed in the distance. Matthew froze, his crayon stopping mid-stroke. His eyes widened, and he began to tremble. This was more than a fear of storms. I knelt beside him. "It's just thunder, sweetheart. It can't hurt you." He shook his head violently, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. He pointed a trembling finger at the window as another flash of lightning lit the room. And then, in a tiny, raspy voice I hadn't heard in over 2 weeks, he whispered a single, devastating word. "Boom." My heart stopped. Boom, what boom, Matthew? His eyes were glazed, locked on some internal horror movie. The loud boom," he whispered. "In the garage, when the sky was angry." A storm. David had disappeared on a stormy night. I held my breath, not daring to move. "Mommy was yelling," he whispered, his voice gaining a faint, terrible momentum. "She was so mad at Daddy. She said the money was hers." Tears streamed down his face now, but he kept talking, the words tumbling out like stones. "Daddy said no. He said it was for me, for college. Mommy called him a name. Then the man came." "What man?" "Baby," I asked, my own voice a strangled whisper. The big man with a loud voice. He and Mommy, they pushed Daddy. Into the garage. I was hiding. Behind the door, I saw. He choked on a sob. The big man had a thing like a hammer, but bigger, and then the boom. And Daddy fell down, and there was red, so much red. He collapsed into my arms, his small body racked with sobs, the floodgates of his trauma finally bursting open. I held him, rocking him back and forth, my own tears mingling with his. The horrific truth, narrated by my 8-year-old grandson, was more awful than anything I could have imagined. Jessica had been there. She had brought a man, Vincent Morty's enforcer, no doubt to confront David. It had ended in murder. I called Detective Miller immediately. With Matthew's testimony, now corroborated by the physical evidence, they had enough for an arrest. Jessica and the big man, who was identified as a known associate of Morty named Frank Valenti, were taken into custody. But the nightmare wasn't over. Finding the killers was one thing, proving it in a court of law was another. The district attorney warned me it would be a difficult case. It was Matthew's word against 2 adults. There was no murder weapon. The case was largely circumstantial. Jessica, from the moment of her arrest, maintained her innocence, claiming Matthew was a confused, traumatized child who had imagined the whole thing. The trial was set to begin 6 months later. 6 months of preparation, of meetings with prosecutors, of helping Dr. Evans prepare Matthew for the terrifying prospect of testifying. My gentle grandson had to relive the worst night of his life over and over again so that a jury might believe him. It was a special kind of torture. The courtroom was a stark, imposing chamber of wood and polished brass. I sat in the front row every day, a steady presence for Matthew, who would glance at me for reassurance. Jessica, dressed in somber, respectable clothing, sat at the defense table, her face a mask of wounded innocence. She never looked at me. Frank Valenti, a hulking brute of a man, glowered from the other table. The prosecution built its case brick by brick. The debt, the life insurance policy, the soil sample from the garage that matched a unique blend found at a construction site Valenti had worked on, the blood smear. It was compelling, but the defense was slick. They painted David as a desperate gambler who had likely run afoul of his creditors and met his end at their hands. They suggested that Matthew, in his trauma, had conflated a memory of his parents arguing with a fictionalized violent event. The pivotal day arrived, Matthew's testimony. The judge had allowed for special accommodations. He would testify via closed-circuit television from the judge's chambers, so he wouldn't have to face his mother and her accomplice directly. I sat in the courtroom, watching him on the monitor. He looked so small and pale, dwarfed by the large leather chair. The prosecutor, a kind woman named Amanda Reed, questioned him gently. "Matthew, can you tell us what you remember about the night your daddy went away?" Matthew's voice was small but clear. He repeated the story he had told me. The storm, the yelling, the man, the boom, the red. He was brave, so incredibly brave. My heart swelled with a painful mix of pride and anguish. Then it was the defense attorney's turn. Jessica's lawyer, a sharp-faced man named Carson, approached his task with a chilling aggression. "Matthew," he began, his voice syrupy sweet, "you love your grandma very much, don't you?" Matthew nodded. "And you've been living with her for a long time now. And she takes care of you, reads you stories, makes you your favorite foods." "Yes," Matthew whispered. "And she misses your daddy very much, doesn't she?" "Yes." "And she's very sad about what happened to him." Matthew's lower lip trembled. "Yes." Carson's voice hardened. "Matthew, has your grandma ever talked to you about what she thinks happened to your daddy?" Amanda Reed shot to her feet. "Objection, leading the witness, Your Honor." "Sustained," the judge said. Carson tried a different tack. "Matthew, sometimes when we're very sad or very scared, our minds can play tricks on us. We can imagine things that didn't really happen. Is it possible, Matthew, that you imagined the loud boom, that you imagined seeing your daddy get hurt?" Matthew looked confused, his brow furrowed. "No," he said, his voice firmer. "I saw it." "But you were hiding," you said. "It was dark. There was a storm. It must have been very frightening. Are you absolutely sure about what you saw?" The questioning went on for what felt like an eternity. Carson trying to poke holes in the memory of a traumatized child. He implied that I had somehow planted the story in Matthew's head. By the time he finished, Matthew was in tears, and I was shaking with a cold, pure rage. The case went to the jury. For 3 days, they deliberated. The tension was unbearable. The media camped outside the courthouse, the story of the killer mom, and the silent boy a sensational headline. I stayed in a hotel near the courthouse, trying to shield Matthew from the frenzy. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, the jury sent a note to the judge. They had reached a verdict. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation. Jessica sat stiffly, but I could see a faint sheen of sweat on her forehead. Valenti looked bored, but his fists were clenched. The bailiff brought in the jury. Their faces were unreadable. "Madam Foreperson," the clerk said, "has the jury reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor." "On the count of murder in the 1st degree against the defendant, Jessica Jessup, how do you find?" The forewoman, a middle-aged woman with graying hair, looked directly at Jessica. "We find the defendant guilty." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Jessica's mask shattered. Her face contorted in disbelief and fury. She screamed, "No, you can't do this. He's just a stupid, lying child." The judge banged his gavel. "Order, order in the court." The verdict for Valenti was read next, also guilty. As the reality of her life sentence settled upon her, something in Jessica seemed to break. The guards were moving to lead her away when she suddenly wrenched herself free and spun around, her eyes wild, locking not on the jury, not on the judge, but directly on me. "It was an accident," she shrieked, her voice raw and ragged. "You want the truth, you old hag. Here's the truth. He wasn't supposed to die. It was just supposed to scare him, to make him change the policy back." The courtroom fell into a stunned silence. Even her own lawyer looked horrified. "I just wanted what was mine," she raved. "He stole it from me. That money was mine. Frank just shoved him and he fell. He hit his head on the edge of the workbench. It was that stupid. Cheap workbench he was so proud of. It was an accident, but he was gone, and then I had to clean it up. I had to protect myself. I had to make it look like he just disappeared." Her confession, desperate and unhinged, echoed in the silent room. It was the final, horrific piece of the puzzle. It wasn't a premeditated, cold-blooded execution. It was a violent argument, born of greed and entitlement, that had escalated into a tragic, fatal accident. And then, the cover-up. The call to Valenti to help dispose of the body, which they had buried in a remote area of the state park, a location she now, in her hysterical state, divulged. The gavel banged again, but the sound was superfluous. It was over. Justice, in its own messy, painful way, had been served. The aftermath was a different kind of agony. David's body was recovered, and we were finally able to lay him to rest. It was a small, quiet funeral. Matthew held my hand throughout. He had started speaking again, in full sentences now, but the shadow of that night would always be a part of him, a scar on his young soul. We never got a full, clear explanation for David's gambling. Dr. Evans thought it might have been a coping mechanism for the stress of the divorce and single parenthood, a secret shame that spiraled out of control. I had to accept that I would never fully understand that part of him. The son I knew and loved was the man who read bedtime stories, who coached soccer, who loved his son more than anything. That was the man I chose to remember. Jessica and Valenti were sentenced to life in prison. The life insurance money was placed in a trust for Matthew, for his future, just as David had intended. Today, a year later, Matthew and I live in my house. We have a routine. We have bad days, days when a sudden noise or a raised voice will send him scurrying to his room. But we have more good days. We bake cookies. We work in the garden. We talk about David. We look at photo albums. We remember the good man he was, not the victim he became. The fight for justice is over. Now begins the longer, quieter fight for healing. It's a fight we wage every day, with love as our only weapon. I am no longer just a grandmother. I am a guardian, a memory keeper, a pillar for a boy who saw the worst of the world and survived. And as I watch him laugh, a real, genuine laugh, as he chases fireflies in the backyard on a summer evening, I know that while the nightmare took so much from us, it could not take everything. It could not take our love, or our hope, or our future. And that, in the end, is a victory greater than any verdict a court could ever deliver.